Hi. So by this stage, you should have had a look at the syllabus. You should have maybe browsed through the textbook. It's online. It's what's showing up here that way. Um, and we should get started. Now, it's going to take a while to get there. And the first thing I'm going to get you to do is to install a few programs to help us do the development, install the development environment. And that is all described in chapter 1 of the textbook. But I thought I'd start with chapter 2, and that way you can see why we need the pieces out of chapter 1 that we're going to install. Okay, so client-side web development, actually client-side development, what does it mean? Well, what happens when you put a URL, and the URL is something like this in the browser? You probably can't see that. I don't know whether I can make it any bigger, but anyway, let's just copy that, and maybe we can make a new text file and make that a bit bigger so you can see it. Right, there's the text there. Okay, https://info340.github.io/client-side-development.html. Okay, so when I put that URL into this browser and go enter, I get a page. So what's happening there? Well, what's happening is the browser is sitting on your computer and it sends that URL, that request, to a web server. And I'll talk a little bit about how it figures out which web server to go to shortly. And that web server says, okay, thank you for your request, and it decomposes that URL enough to figure out what you're asking for. And then it puts together the response and it sends it back to you. And because I'm using a browser, the textbook suggests Chrome, I'm using Firefox. Safari will probably do, as will probably Edge. I'd suggest using either Chrome or Firefox. The browser will take the response from the web server and what's called render it. Right? The web server is just sending stuff that's not human readable. I think you may have seen this stuff before, right? This is what's coming back in the response. It's HTML. And then it accesses JavaScript and CSS. Right, so there's lots of stuff. I suppose you can read it, but it's a little hard to figure out exactly what's happening. But what is happening is it renders this. Okay, once it renders that, so what? Well, let's just start with what are the pieces of that. So the request comes in, and it pulls in index.html if that was what was in the URL, right? And then, as you saw here, there's various other pieces. Let's go back to the top. There's various other pieces that get pulled in, right? there's CSS files, and there are JavaScript JS files. And often those things will live somewhere on the same web server as the HTML file. The web server, which is a program that lives on somebody else's computer usually, will then take those pieces and put them together appropriately and send them out. Now, in this particular case, it's not going to take the JS, it's not going to take the CSS files. Once this HTML file is received by your browser's going to go through and try and render it. But it doesn't have header-attributes.js. It doesn't have plugin-font settings.css. It's got to go off and get them. And that's what it does. So it hits the web server again, and if you've got a development version of the web of a browser, you can see all of the web requests that the browser is going to do in order to render the file. It needs to compose the rendering out of all of the information in this HTML file. Now, what does it mean, client-side web development? Well, all of that composition is happening in the browser, and the browser is usually considered to be a client. The web server is the server piece in this client-server relationship. So client-side web development is doing programming that will change what happens in the browser. It'll change the way the browser renders the HTML that comes down. And there are the three pieces that I've talked about before: HTML, hypertext markup language, CSS, cascading style sheets, and JS, JavaScript. And each of those things needs to be pulled together in order to render the web page. And then there's other stuff that you might want to call assets. Assets can be images like PNG, JPEG, or GIF, or they could be videos or fonts or music or audio files. They could be lots of different assets. So that's why the generic term asset is used rather than just images. Now, that URL that I've typed in is actually composed of lots of different pieces. And there's a nice color-coded, and I apologize if that's a little hard to read, but that's color-coded decomposing of a particularly long URL. The first part is, I would call it the protocol. The textbook calls it the scheme, but that's the way that your laptop is going to talk to the web server. It could be HTTPS. It's most likely to be HTTPS these days. That's Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure. And because we're very interested in security these days, you don't want to just use HTTP if you can avoid it. This little padlock up here that might be a bit hard to see in the URL part of the browser will tell you that it's secure. And the next piece, the www.domain.com, in the textbook's case that's info340.github.io, that's the domain, right? That's the, if you like, the address of the web server. That's how we tell which web server we're going to. That's why www.google.com is different from www.microsoft.com is different from www.amazon.com. Once we've got to that, well, and then the protocol we're using can be slightly different, or it can be somewhere slightly different. When we use HTTPS, there's what's called a well-known port, or a predefined or default port that we're going to go to on that web server. And for HTTPS, that default port is number 443. But it doesn't have to be. It can be any number between probably 1 and 65,535. I think it's a 16-bit number, unsigned, so I think it can go up there. But usually it's in the well-known ports range, and usually that's below 1024. Okay, that's the port, and you usually put a colon after the domain and give the numerical value of the port. Okay, so now we're on the web server, we've got the right port, we've got the right domain, and then we need to know somewhere within the hierarchy of the web server which files to get access to, and that's given by the path, right? That's just like a standard path if you're browsing a directory on a computer, and it's usually just directly a directory or a virtual directory on the web server. After that, there's a question mark, and then there's the potential to have a query, and that query gives extra information to the web server about particularly what you're interested in seeing. It may not be there, it doesn't have to be there. And then finally there's another optional piece, which is the fragment, and that has a leading hashtag or pound sign, and so we get potentially the full scheme. Okay, and that is what we're doing. Now we're going to be doing client-side web development, but we don't want to have our files served out by somebody else's server. So we're going to use what's called a development server that's going to run on the same machine as your development environment. And that makes things quicker, makes things a little easier. It does hide some complexities, but we'll get there in the end. And I recommend that we install Live Server and use that. Okay, now go back to chapter 1 and have a look at the stuff that it's asking us to install. Right, Google Chrome, Visual Studio Code, Node.js, npm, Git, Git Bash, and then later on I think it actually suggests also that we install Jest, which is a testing framework, and then, as we saw in chapter 2, Live Server. So the next assignment I'm going to get you to do is to do all that installation. If you have problems, ask a question on the discussion forum, because if you have the problem, somebody else will too. And I'd rather answer one question to everybody rather than the same question to 10 people separately. So please ask there. It's expected that there'll be some issues getting stuff installed. Let's just do it. I'm assuming everybody is going to be running under Windows. As you can see, my machine here is actually a Mac, so Mac will work just as well for all of this, so don't worry about that. But once you've got all of that stuff installed, there's an assignment I'm going to put up in Blackboard that will just get you to run, where's it gone? There's my Visual Studio Code. And actually it's this one, this version of Visual Studio Code. So this is my, can I zoom in? Control equals, there we go, make it a bit bigger. I'm going to ask you to run these 5 commands and post the output into Blackboard. I've already gone through and installed all of those things. So if I go to Git Bash, and you can see I've already done it here, and just paste those 5 lines just showing the versions of Git, Node, npm, Jest and Live Server, what you'll see is the 5 versions, right? There's the Git version, the Node version, the npm version, that's Node Package Manager, Jest, which is our testing framework, and Live Server, which is our development web server. So that's not up in Blackboard just yet. I'll do that shortly, so by the time you view this it should be there. Yeah, and that'll be what you need to do in order to get the first week's work done. I suggest you read a bit more of the textbook too, and I will put together more programming assignments, but I think getting everything installed and making sure it's all working is probably enough for the first week. Watch out for more videos, watch out for more announcements. Make sure you check your community college email regularly, and let's